The auction had been over for 11 minutes when Edward Cavendish, Earl of Ashmore, understood that he had lost Thornfield Park for good. He stood at the back of the solicitor's office on Jermyn Street, his hat in his hands, while Mr. Fitch read the final deed of transfer aloud in the voice of a man who had delivered bad news so many times that it no longer troubled him. The fire was low. The room smelled of old paper and tallow. Outside the window, London continued at its usual indifferent pace, carriages rattling over cobblestones, a flower seller's cry cutting thin through the glass, a boy in a brown coat driving a reluctant donkey across the lane. Edward heard none of it. He heard only Fitch's voice naming the figure, £11,400, and the name of the buyer. Halford. Sir Gerald Halford, whose father had once called Edward's father a fool to his face in front of 3 witnesses at a card table in White's, and who had spent the last 2 years acquiring every debt note he could find attached to the Ashmore estate with the patience of a man who had never once doubted that he would eventually win. Edward had expected him to appear at the auction in person, to watch, to permit himself the visible satisfaction of it. He had not. He had sent a representative, a meticulous young clerk in a coat too good for a clerk, who had bid in a low, correct voice, and had stopped the moment the gavel fell, and had not looked at Edward once. Edward had stood at the front of the room and watched the gavel fall and said nothing. He said nothing now. "My lord," Fitch said carefully, setting down the document and removing his spectacles, "there is the matter of the outstanding notes of hand. I am aware of the notes. Yes, £3,200 remaining across 4 instruments. The buyer of the estate does not hold these. They are still current obligations." Fitch placed his spectacles on his nose again and consulted a second document. "However, I have received word this morning that the notes have been transferred." Edward looked up. "Transferred to whom?" Fitch cleared his throat. It was a small sound, apologetic and precise. "To a Miss Cecily Hargrove of Dorset. She acquired all 4 instruments from their respective holders last Tuesday. The transactions were completed separately and in full." The name meant nothing to him. He stood in the gray November afternoon outside the office and held his hat in his hands for a moment. And he thought about the shape of what he had just been told. A woman he did not know had, on the Tuesday before the auction, purchased £3,200 of his most pressing debt. She had not presented herself at the auction. She had not written to him. She had simply acquired the instruments, retired to whatever rooms she kept in Dorset, and waited for Fitch to inform him. The notes were not a small sum for anyone. For a private woman without title, they would have represented something significant. It was not the sum of a stranger acting from charity. Something had moved without his knowledge, and it had moved precisely. If you have ever watched a man discover that the game he believed he was losing had a second board he did not know existed, you will understand the particular quality of stillness that settled over Edward Cavendish on that pavement. He did not yet know whether the second board was threat or mercy. He only knew that he had been wrong about the shape of his situation, and that a man in his position could not afford to remain wrong for long. He wrote to his solicitor for her direction and presented himself at her lodgings 3 days later. Cecily Hargrove lived in a set of rooms in a quiet street off the Strand, 2 flights up, with a door that required 2 attempts to open, and a sitting room that contained considerably more books than furniture. She was 24 years old, slight in frame, with dark hair pinned simply, and a gown of soft gray that had been well made a few years ago, and had since been carefully maintained. She did not look up immediately when the maid announced him. She finished the sentence she was writing, set her pen down with a deliberateness that he recognized as preparation, and then rose. Her eyes, when they met his, were steady and a little measuring. "Lord Ashmore," she said, "I had expected you sooner." He would think about that sentence later. The particular flatness of it. The way it suggested she had prepared not only for his arrival, but for the possibility of his delay, and had decided how she would handle each. He took the chair she indicated and did not remove his gloves. "Miss Hargrove," he said, "I understand you are now the holder of my outstanding notes." "I am." "Then I should like to know your terms." She sat very still for a moment, her hands folded in her lap. She was not afraid of him. He was not accustomed to women who were not afraid of him, not because he was a cruel man, but because an earl in a room made most people careful. And she was not being careful in that particular way. She was considering him, which was different. "My terms," she said, "are that the notes will be held without demand for collection, until such time as you have the means to retire them. I require only the legal interest annually, which I think you will find is manageable. There will be no pressure on the principal." She paused. "I am not Sir Gerald Halford, my lord." The name landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. "I am aware," he said, "that you are not Halford. I should like to understand why a woman I have never met purchased £3,000 of my debt, at what must have been some personal inconvenience." "Some," she agreed. "Then the question remains." She looked at him for a long moment, weighing not the honesty of the answer, but its usefulness, whether it would help him or confuse him or produce a response she was not prepared to manage. Then she said, "You sold Thornfield Park to Halford because you had no choice. You had set the reserve yourself. You could have set it lower and recovered the debt instruments privately before the auction cleared. You did not. You let the auction run until Halford had paid the full value, which meant the instruments remained on the open market until the last moment. You chose to be sold to your enemy at the proper price rather than negotiate a partial dignity at a lesser one." A brief pause. "That is not the decision of a man who does not understand what he is doing. I was in Dorset last spring when your father's old steward, Mr. Briggs, told me that story. He told it as an illustration of what he called a reckless gesture of pride." "And you disagreed," Edward said. "I thought it was something else," she said. "A man who will not compromise his word, even when the cost is his own house, is the kind of man whose debt I am willing to hold. Halford's man would have purchased those notes the moment Thornfield cleared. I had to act before Tuesday, or the moment was gone." He regarded her. She returned his regard without flinching, and he thought, she has been rehearsing this conversation in her head for some time. She rehearsed it because she was not certain how it would go, and she came anyway. "You knew Briggs," he said. "He was my father's friend. My father was his vicar in Wiltshire before we removed to Dorset 14 years ago." A slight pause. "Your father was kind to mine once. A small kindness, nothing that would register for an earl. A letter of recommendation for a parish living, when my father had been passed over twice and was not optimistic about a third application. It was the difference between security and a great deal of difficulty. That was the shape of it then. A chain of small human connections, stretching back 14 years and across 2 counties, fragile enough that the ordinary course of time should have dissolved it. And yet it had held. It had held long enough for a woman he had never met to spend her mother's savings on his ruin before Halford's man could reach those instruments first. "I cannot in good conscience accept this," he said. "You already have," she said quietly. "The transfer is complete and recorded. The interest will be owing in April. I suggest you correspond through Mr. Fitch." She rose, which was a dismissal, and held it with the composure of a woman who had learned to conclude conversations with men of higher station by making the transaction seem entirely natural. "Good day, my lord." He stood on the pavement below and understood that he had been managed, not cruelly, not for personal advantage, as far as he could determine. Simply managed by a woman in a gray gown in a room full of books, who had decided that the shape of his ruin was not fixed and had acted on that decision with her own money, and had not particularly required his opinion on the matter. He found reasons to write to her through March. They were legitimate reasons, among them a question about the instrument dates, a matter regarding one of the 4 notes that had been held by a tradesman and was slightly irregularly worded, a query about the interest calculation and whether it ran from the date of original issuance or the date of transfer. She answered each letter within 2 days, in a handwriting that was small and level and entirely without flourish, and the answers were precise and informed, and offered nothing beyond what was strictly necessary. She did not invite further correspondence. She did not discourage it either. In the middle of February, he acknowledged to himself that the correspondence had ceased to be about the notes. He wrote to tell her that he found himself curious about her circumstances. "I do not know how you came to have £3,000 available last autumn, and I recognize the question is impertinent. You know a great deal about my situation, and I know almost nothing of yours, and this strikes me as a disproportion I would remedy if you were willing." She wrote that she had it from her mother's estate, which had come to her on her mother's death 2 years ago. "My father left very little. My mother, rather more, through the quiet economies of a long life. I live carefully. I do not find that a hardship." He wrote that she evidently did not. That is evident. "Are you in London at present, or still in Dorset?" She wrote that she was in London, had been since December. "I find the lending library on Booksellers' Row adequate for my purposes, and the rooms are cheaper in winter." He stood in the library of the Mayfair house his friend Everton let him use, and read that sentence twice. The lending library. Not the circulating library with its subscription fee. The lending library, which charged by the volume, and the rooms were cheaper in winter. She had spent her mother's savings on his debt. She was living cheaply in December. He felt something shift in the region of his chest, something that had been very still for a long time, and was now, without warning, not still at all. He did not examine it closely. He wrote to mention a lending library in Arlington Street with a considerably larger collection. "If you have not been, I would recommend it." He sent the letter before he could reconsider it, and spent the following 4 days wishing he had not. And then her answer arrived on the 5th day, saying she had been. "The collection on natural philosophy is particularly good. I was not aware you had an interest in lending libraries." He wrote that he had an interest in books. Libraries are a convenient approximation when one's own have been sold with the house. She wrote back 2 days later. "I imagine that is the particular cruelty of it. Not only the rooms that go, but everything that accumulated inside them. The books are the rooms, in a way." He put that letter in his coat pocket and kept it there for a week. They met by accident, or by the kind of accident 2 people create when they have been corresponding about a lending library without quite acknowledging why. He was returning a volume on the 2nd Tuesday of March, when she arrived to collect one. And they stood in the narrow aisle between the shelves for a moment, with a considerable awkwardness, and a considerable amount of pretending there was no awkwardness at all. She wore a dark green spencer over a cream gown, her hair dressed simply. She looked, he thought, precisely as her letters sounded. Composed and particular, and very slightly guarded. In the way of someone who has learned that composure is more reliable than the alternative. Miss Hargrove, he said. Lord Ashmore, she said. Thucydides? He looked at the volume in his hand. I have been using it to avoid thinking about my affairs. Something happened at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, the precise acknowledgement of one. How effective, she said. Moderately. He paused. May I walk with you? If you are not engaged. A brief silence, just long enough to be honest. I'm not engaged. They walked along Arlington Street in the cold March light, and he discovered that she was considerably easier to talk to than he had anticipated. She spoke plainly and listened specifically. She did not flatter him. When she disagreed, she said so without ceremony and moved on, and he found himself having to think more carefully about what he actually believed in order to defend it, which was its own kind of pleasure. They had arrived, without his quite intending it, at the subject of Halford. You think I should approach him directly, he said. I think you should not, she said. I think you have been treating this as a conflict between yourself and Sir Gerald Halford, when it is more accurately a conflict between yourself and the structure of accumulated debt. Halford is the instrument, not the engine. If you defeat the instrument, another will present itself. The question is how to reduce the debt itself, steadily, so that his hold over the remaining instruments diminishes rather than compounds. You are yourself an instrument in the situation, he said. You purchased the notes specifically to prevent him from acquiring them. I am aware of that. Then the tactic was deliberate. Yes, she said without hesitation. I thought it was justified. He stopped walking. She stopped a half step later and turned to look at him. The cold air held between them. A cart went past on the street. A pigeon landed on a stone step and regarded them both with complete indifference. Why? He said. Not the polite question he had asked in November. The actual one. She looked at him for a long moment, with the measuring quality he had come to know, and then she said, Because I did not want to watch Thornfield Park become a monument to the Halford family's satisfaction. Because Mr. Briggs told me what you did at the auction, and I thought the story would end badly without some interference. Because I had the means, and I thought it was a better use of my mother's money than leaving it to accumulate in a bank while I found a cheaper room in Dorset. A pause. And because I thought the man who made that gesture was someone I might want to know. He looked at her. She looked back. That, he said, is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in approximately 2 years. It seemed pointless to be otherwise, she said. You were going to ask until I told you the truth. I would rather tell it the first time. He thought about the letters, the care she had taken with each one. He thought about the woman in front of him, who had spent her mother's savings on his ruin, not from sentiment he had earned, but from a conviction about character she had formed from a second-hand story told by an old man in Dorset, and who had answered his letters every Tuesday and agreed to walk on Thursdays, and had just told him the plain truth without prettifying it. Miss Hargrove, he said, would you be willing to walk with me again on Thursday? If you have watched a woman receive the beginning of something she had not permitted herself to expect, you will know the quality of the breath she took. Brief. Not quite steadying. Her eyes held his for a moment before she answered. Yes, she said. I would. If this is the moment you have been waiting for, let it settle. She said yes on a cold March afternoon in Arlington Street, while a pigeon reconsidered its step. And she said it in the plain voice she used for everything. And it meant rather more than its 2 syllables. They walked on Thursdays for the rest of March and into April, when the interest fell due, and she accepted it from Fitch with the same practical composure she brought to everything, and then into May, when the warmth came, and they walked farther and talked longer. He learned that she had taught herself Italian from a grammar book found in a lending library in Dorchester, that she had 2 strong opinions about enclosure and 1 about the Corn Laws, and that she thought the novel as a form was rather more rigorous than its detractors allowed. She learned that he had spent 2 years before his father's death managing a situation he had not created, and that the management had cost him most of what had once made him easy to be around. They talked about the things they had read. They disagreed about Cowper. He told her about Thornfield Park in April. Not the financial record of it, but the house itself. The kitchen garden his mother had kept. The quality of light in the North Library on winter mornings. The stone wall along the south field that had been there longer than any Cavendish could account for, with a gap in it that every generation of children had used to escape the grounds, and which every generation of parents had decided was not worth the trouble to repair. She listened in the way she always listened, which was to say that she actually did, and when he finished, she said, "What would you need to recover it?" "A great deal of money and Halford's goodwill," he said, "neither of which I expect soon, or for Halford to make a significant error." "He is not a careful man," she said. "He is a confident one. They are not the same." He looked at her. "You have been thinking about this." "I have had some months," she said simply. What she had been thinking, he discovered over the following weeks. Halford's acquisition of the debt instruments before the auction had been rapid, and in at least 1 instance imprecise. She had asked a careful question through Fitch, who had asked a careful question of a second solicitor, who had discovered that one of the 4 instruments Halford had acquired before the auction had been purchased from a tradesman who had no legal right to sell it. The note had been settled between the tradesman and Edward's father 11 years prior, by means of a letter that no one had produced because no one had thought to ask. The letter existed. It had been sitting in the tradesman's own files, unfiled and forgotten, in a box from the previous decade. It was not sufficient to reverse the auction. It was sufficient to raise a genuine question about whether Halford had acted in complete good faith, and in a world where reputation was currency, a carefully placed question was worth considerably more than its apparent weight. It was in the course of those conversations, on a Thursday in late May, that he witnessed something he had not expected. They had turned from the subject of Halford's instruments toward the street, and as they rounded the corner onto King Street, they came upon a small scene. A boy of perhaps 7 years, in a thin coat that had seen 2 winters too many, standing at the curb with his hat in his hands, and a look on his face that contained the particular combination of determination and misery produced by a child who has lost something and is not certain he is allowed to cry about it. Beside him stood a woman of middling years who was very clearly not his family, doing nothing in particular to help. 2 men had walked past while Edward watched. Cecily had stopped walking. She asked the boy, in a voice that was direct and entirely without false tenderness, what had happened. "A coin," he said. He had been given a halfpenny for a message and had dropped it in the gutter, and the gutter had it. She looked at him for a moment, with the same measuring quality she brought to everything. And then she said, "How far did you carry the message?" He told her. She considered it with evident seriousness, as though the economics of the situation were a matter requiring proper attention, and then she produced a halfpenny from her reticule and said, "A halfpenny is the correct sum for that distance. You have earned it. The gutter is the gutter's problem." She pressed the coin into his hand and did not watch him go. Edward had stopped beside her. She turned back to the walk as though what had just happened was entirely unremarkable. He did not say anything for a long moment. "You did not tell him it would all be well," he said at last. "I did not know that it would be," she said. "I knew that he had earned the halfpenny. That was the part I could address." He walked beside her in silence for half a block, and he thought about what he had just watched. She had not offered sentiment or false comfort. She had looked at the shape of the boy's actual problem: a coin, an earned sum, a child who had done his work correctly and been failed by chance, and she had addressed the part that was addressable, without ceremony, without requiring his gratitude. It was the most efficient form of kindness he had ever seen. He thought about the notes of hand, purchased on a Tuesday in October before Halford's man could reach them, with no announcement and no expectation of acknowledgement. He thought about the letters every Tuesday, precise and unhurried, answering the questions he actually asked rather than the ones he was supposed to ask. He thought about November, and the particular way she had said, "I am not Sir Gerald Halford, my lord." As though that fact were simply a matter of clarification, and not the whole of his situation altered in one afternoon. He understood, in that moment, something he had been approaching from a considerable distance. He came to her sitting room on a Thursday in June, having read Fitch's account of the letter in full, and sat down in the chair across from her, the same chair he had occupied in November, in a room he now knew considerably better. "You found the letter," he said. "Fitch found it. I suggested he might look." "You suggested it because you thought it existed." "I thought it was possible that it existed," she said. A man who acquired 4 instruments in 3 days acquired them imperfectly. Speed produces gaps. He looked at her. The June light was warm through the single window, falling across the table where she worked, catching the edge of a volume she had been reading and left open at the spine. She had a faint crease between her brows that appeared when she was working something through. And it was there now. The controlled tension of a woman who had brought him something, and was not entirely certain how he would receive it. "Cecily," he said. She looked up. "I owe you £3,200, he said. "I owe you the better part of my equanimity for the past 6 months, and I appear to owe you a strategy for recovering my house from the man who took it." He paused. "That is a considerable accumulation." "I did not intend any of it as debt," she said carefully. "I know you did not. That is not what I am saying." He set his hat on the table and looked at her directly. He had been circling something for several weeks without quite looking at it. And he looked at it now. She was the most honest person he had ever known. She deserved the same. "What I am saying is that I have no adequate means of accounting for what you have done, and I have no adequate means of accounting for what has followed from it. And I think those 2 things are connected. I want you to understand clearly that the connection does not make the second less real. I do not want you to think I am confused about what I feel because of what I owe you. I am not confused." She was very still. She was excellent at stillness. It was one of the first things he had noticed about her in November, and it had never changed. Her hands were folded in her lap, and they were not entirely steady. And he noticed that too. "What I would like," he said, "is to see the notes discharged through the usual legal arrangement, clearly and separately, so there is no confusion between what I owe you in any financial sense and what I have not the slightest wish to account for in any instrument. The notes can be retired over time. The other thing cannot be retired at all, and I do not want it retired." He paused. "I am asking if you will allow me to call on you properly, with a clear understanding of what I am asking and what I am not." The summer afternoon continued outside the window, perfectly indifferent to the weight of the room above it. "You are not asking because of the debt," she said. "I am asking in spite of it," he said. "You saved me from Halford, and I think that is the smaller of the 2 things you have done." The larger is that you wrote to me on Tuesdays and walked with me on Thursdays and told me the truth about why you bought those notes when you could have made it comfortable and vague, and did not appear to require anything of me in return for any of it except that I be honest with you. That is not a thing I expected to find. I do not intend to treat it as ordinary. A silence. Then quietly, "You may call on me properly." He exhaled. She looked at her hands for a moment, and then looked at him, and there was something in her face that was not quite a smile, and was very close to relief. And he thought, she has been as careful about this as I have, as uncertain, as glad that it has gone this way. "The notes," she said with her characteristic practicality, "can be addressed entirely through Fitch." "Entirely through Fitch," he agreed. "I will see to it." The Halford matter resolved over the summer through the particular quality of attention she had already been applying to it. The letter regarding the settled instrument became known to the appropriate people through appropriate channels, not as accusation, but as a document that existed and whose existence was undeniable. There were quiet conversations between solicitors. There was a recalculation of what could be maintained and what could not. By September, there was an offer from Halford's camp, not Thornfield Park, which was never coming back, but terms regarding the outstanding instruments that were considerably more favorable than anything November had suggested. Edward accepted the terms through Fitch and told no one except Cecily, who received the news in her sitting room with the same measured composure she received everything, and then said very quietly, "Good." He had not told her about his father's miniature before. It seemed the right moment now, with the September light at the window and the accounts finally settled on paper, if not in full in practice. He had carried it since his father's death, a small oval portrait in a plain gold frame that his father had carried before him, the painting worn at the edges where 3 generations of Cavendish thumbs had held it in the same place. He was not a sentimental man, or had not believed himself to be. He had kept it because it was the right thing to do, and had not examined why the rightness of it was so immediate. He told her about it that afternoon, about his father, and the card table in White's, and the letter of recommendation that had gone to Briggs's vicar 30 years ago, and all the small things his father had done that had seemed like nothing, and had turned out to be something, and how he had managed the estate into trouble, not from carelessness, but from the particular stubbornness of a man who believed he could fix what he had inherited without asking anyone for help, and how that belief had cost him Thornfield Park, and how the cost had arrived 2 years after his father was gone. He set the miniature on the table between them. She looked at it for a long moment. She did not touch it. "He looks like a man who would write a letter for a clergyman he had never met." "Yes," Edward said. "He does." She looked up at him. The afternoon was warm and still, and the room was quiet, and something passed between them that was not a touch, and was not a word, but was both of those things in the form that did not require either. "He would have liked you," Edward said. "He would have liked you very much." They were engaged by August, announced in the Morning Chronicle in a notice that gave his name and title, and her name and county, and nothing further, which was sufficient. Lady Mayhew, his father's sister, who had watched the Ashmore estate's deterioration with barely concealed satisfaction for 3 years, received the news with visible uncertainty. She called on him the afternoon of the notice and said, with the careful precision of a woman recalibrating, "Hargrove, I do not know the family." "You would not," he said. "Her father was a clergyman in Wiltshire." A pause. "A clergyman's daughter. With a thorough understanding of debt instruments, a patience I have never encountered in anyone of any station, and a considerably more accurate assessment of my situation than anyone else managed in 3 years." He looked at his aunt steadily. I recommend the acquaintance. Lady Mayhew opened her fan, examined it, and closed it again. She had learned to read a room over 50 years of practice, and what she read in this one was that her nephew was not asking her opinion. He was informing her of his decision, with perfect composure and without a particle of defiance, and that combination, she thought, was entirely new in him. She presented herself at Cecily's rooms the following Wednesday, and sat in the small sitting room with its unreasonable quantity of books, and drank the tea that was offered, and asked several precise questions, and Cecily answered them with the same directness she brought to everything. Lady Mayhew asked about her father's parish, and her mother's family, and the length of time she had been in London, and whether she had any connections in town beyond what the situation with the Ashmore estate had produced. She asked these questions with the smooth efficiency of a woman who had been conducting this particular assessment for 5 decades, and who had never had cause to find it difficult. It was when she asked about the instruments, carefully and without naming them directly, that the quality of the conversation shifted. Cecily told her, with the same even directness, exactly what she had done and why, and Lady Mayhew listened without visible expression, and when Cecily had finished, she said, "A woman of no connections purchasing a peer's debt. The town will say it was calculation." "The town says many things," Cecily said. "I find it is not generally worth the effort of correcting." Lady Mayhew looked at her for a moment. "No," she said at last. "I do not suppose it is." By the end of an hour, she had revised her position entirely, which she would not have admitted, and which was plainly visible to anyone who knew how to read her. Cecily told Edward that evening that his aunt had the quickest mind of any woman she had met that month. He said, "She would be very pleased to hear that." "I suspect she already knows," Cecily said. There was, in October, a dinner at the house of a mutual acquaintance at which Halford was present. Edward had not known this before accepting the invitation. Cecily had known it and had told him plainly, and had also told him that she thought he should go. They went. Halford was a broad man of 50, with the particular confidence of someone who had spent his entire life being correct about the outcomes of things, and who had consequently never developed the muscle that manages being wrong. He crossed the room to Edward before the first remove, with a smile calibrated precisely to the distance between victory and condescension, and said, "Ashmore, I believe congratulations are in order." He meant the engagement. He said it as a man says something that costs him nothing. "Thank you," Edward said. He did not move. Halford's gaze shifted to Cecily, and he made the assessment that men like him made so quickly it was almost invisible. Station, gown, connection, utility. "Miss Hargrove," he said, "I believe you hold certain instruments connected to the Ashmore estate. Formerly held, perhaps, given the recent settlement." "Entirely settled," Cecily said. She looked at him with the steady, measuring quality she brought to everything. "Through Mr. Fitch. I believe your solicitor has the confirmation." "Of course," Halford said. He was still smiling. A fortunate arrangement for all concerned. "It was a fair one," she said. "I find fair arrangements tend to be fortunate." Halford looked at her for a moment, and something in his expression shifted by a very small degree. Not retreat. Something more like recalibration. He had expected, Edward thought, a woman who would be flattered by his attention or unsettled by his proximity, and he had received instead a woman who was neither, who had looked at the shape of his confidence and addressed it in exactly the same direct, unhurried way she addressed everything else. The smile remained, but it had changed its quality. "Quite so," Halford said, and withdrew. Edward became aware, some minutes later, that he had been holding himself very still since Halford had appeared at his elbow, the way a man holds himself still when something is at stake, and he has not yet determined whether to speak or act or simply wait. Cecily had not looked at him during the exchange. She had not needed to. She had addressed the thing directly, in the manner she always addressed things directly, and she had done it as though Halford's particular brand of calibrated pleasantness were simply a problem with a recognizable shape, and therefore a recognizable solution. He had watched her, and understood that she had been prepared for this moment too, as she had been prepared for his arrival in November, as she was prepared for most things. He did not find this unsettling. He found it one of the qualities he loved most. Edward stood beside her in the warm room and said nothing, and she said nothing, and the dinner continued around them as dinners do. They were married in December, quietly, in a church in Wiltshire that had been her father's, with Mr. Briggs among the small congregation, old and very upright, watching with the evident satisfaction of a man who believed the chain of events had arrived precisely where it ought to have arrived. The light through the stone windows was gray and thin. The wind off the downs required coats on the walk to the small inn where they had arranged a modest celebration. It was a very cold day, and a very good one. Edward had not recovered Thornfield Park. He did not expect to recover it soon. They had let a house outside Bath for the winter, small and well-proportioned, with a garden that would be reasonable in spring, and a library that was their own, built from their combined collections shelved together in the order that seemed right to both of them, without any of the gaps that the sold volumes had left in his. The notes of hand had been discharged in full by November, through the terms Fitch had arranged. Cecily had received the final confirmation without ceremony, and had put most of the returned capital into the Bank of England, and some of it into the new curtains, which were dark green and very practical, and which she had selected from a shop on Milsom Street, with her characteristic precision. He told her that on the first evening in the new house, with the fire lit against the December cold and the curtains pulled against the dark, she was reading. He was reading. The candles were steady. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, visible at the gap between the curtain and the frame as a softness in the dark. "The curtains," he said. She looked up. "They are exactly right," he said. She considered this for a moment with the attentiveness she brought to things that were not only about what they were about. "They were a very reasonable price," she said. "The shop on Milsom Street." "I did not mean the price." She looked at him across the warm room with the fire between them and the books on the walls and the snow falling outside the window they had claimed together, and she understood precisely what he meant. "No," she said. "Neither did I." He went back to his book. She went back to hers. The fire burned down slowly through the evening. The room held its warmth. The books stood in their proper order on the shelves, and the curtains held the night outside where it belonged, and the snow continued its patient work on the garden and the road and the stone wall along the south field, which had a gap in it from previous tenants' children, and which neither of them had yet had occasion to discover, but which they would find in the spring, and which would not be repaired. On the mantelpiece, between a small earthenware vase and a volume on the Peloponnesian War that had never quite made it to the shelves, the miniature sat in its plain gold frame, the paint worn at the edges where 3 generations of Cavendish thumbs had held it. The fire caught the edge of it and lit it briefly. The room was quiet and good.